morning. I'm so glad you were able to tear yourself away from your breakfast buffets and your hangover treatments to make it here this morning. Thank you very much for Art Basel for continuing this tradition of surrounding the commercial fizzle with a little bit of intellectual programming. This is a great tradition. It now continues on this rather muggy but very pretty new site. It's wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues in the audience, and I'd like to give a shout out to my students and my faculty colleagues from New York. So, well, we had a storm this morning, and it's been a bit of a perfect storm for museums as well, hasn't it? It's been a tough couple of years. Endowments, should you have one, are depleted. Donations are down on the whole. Public subsidies are falling, if you have them, of course. As we speak, curators in France are preparing to go on strike to protest declining subsidies. Corporate support is frozen and tied ever more closely to marketing. Foundation support is shrinking. Many foundations are getting out of the art business altogether. The art is a little bit cheaper, although after the last few days, I don't know how long that will last. And every other expense category of running a museum is ballooning and ballooning fast. Meanwhile, attendance is not yet where we would like it to be. Last summer's NEA surveys told us that for the first time, attendance at visual art museums is beginning to slip a little bit. 75% of Americans do not regularly visit art museums. There are huge looming questions about what museums can be, what they ought to be in the 21st century, many, many unanswered questions. So you may wonder, given all these realities, who would have the guts, or I should probably say the stomach, to take charge of a major art institution today. Look no further than this panel. Here they are, the brave souls. All of them have taken over major visual art institutions in the last couple of years. Some of them are so new to the job that their boxes of books are barely unpacked. The paint is still drying in their offices. The two in the middle. Let me very briefly introduce them to you, and then I'll say more about them as we go. We have Marc, the director of the National Gallery of Canada, in white. We have Timothy Rubb in black in the middle from the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Osvaldo Sánchez to my right from the Museum of Modern Art in Mexico City. Philippe Vergne from DIA over in gray. And Lynn Zelevansky just recently arrived at the Carnegie Museum of Art. Please welcome them all, and thank you already. That was, of course, in alphabetical order. So the good news is that while your challenges are daunting, your opportunities are also historic. This group and their colleagues, and there have been a couple of smaller museums you may have heard of that also have new directors these days. This group will help to figure out what it means to collect art and exhibit art in the 21st century. They will lead museums into an era of globalization. They will lead museums into a future that will be virtual and networked and unfamiliar in many, many ways. So these are some of the smaller items in their job descriptions, and it's what we're here to talk about today. So what I was thinking of doing is beginning our conversation, and by the way, there will be time at the very end for questions, so if you're thinking of that, start thinking now. What I was thinking of doing is asking each of you, as you look out at this future in which you will have such a strong role to play, what is the first issue that jumps out at you? And I just want to talk very briefly, just to throw some few key issues out on the table. And we'll start with Marc. We're going to go in alphabetical order this time again. Marc, you took over Canada's premier visual art institution, 85% public subsidies. It's a major institution. And you did this, you just took over in January, coming from the Montreal Museum of Contemporary Art. Your earlier postings have included the Brooklyn Museum, the Albright Knox, And like everyone on this panel, Marc is also a writer and a curator, of course, a distinguished one. He also chairs the Public Affairs Committee of the American Association of Art Museum Directors. He's here today to share his own thoughts. So Marc, very briefly, what is this sort of big issue that jumps out for you?
Thanks, András. I think I won the movie prize here alphabetically. It's the first time we've ever been listed alphabetically, and somebody with a name like M should have to start. And also, my subject is probably more taboo than some of the others that we'll mention, because what I think about these days is really the art market. And we're not supposed to think about the art market. Us museum directors, this is a church and state issue, of course. But I think, and I don't speak about my colleagues when I say I think that it's disingenuous and a little bit coy about us as a society not really discussing the issue of the role of art museums in the art market.
So what do you mean by that specifically?
We buy, occasionally we sell, hopefully in order to buy more. Our exhibitions have influence. They don't have the influence that cliches often would presume that they have. For example, you were in Montreal when Mike Moses pulled out these statistics that said essentially that the amount of times an object has been presented in an art museum or discussed in a museum catalog has no bearing on how much money it's going to fetch at auction, which was a huge surprise to everyone in the room. And his research went back, what was it, 30 years. He could not find a demonstrable correlation between those things. It turns out we don't know very much about the relationship of art museums to the market. I think about it because at the National Gallery of Canada we have a priority, and that is contemporary art, and contemporary Canadian art especially. We're a small and traditionally timid market in Canada, and if there isn't any money to produce art, then we can't show any. So we have to think, I work for the public, and I have the public's best interest at heart, but the public wants me, of course, created this institution so that we think about the public's artists. And to encourage a market and to encourage more visibility for Canadian artists, we need to have instruments so that the public and the art buying public in particular can have a sense of who the best artists are from the point of view of the institution. So we have to establish ourselves as a benchmark in order to bring more money into the system, because there isn't enough.
And this is mildly controversial. Most people don't think of museums and the market in the same breath. There's sort of supposed to be a bit of yin and yang quality to those
But
two.
in our situation, I think we're getting into the area of we have to think about our social responsibility, not only in the church and state separation, but in the role that we actually play and understand it and respect it, and be not just actors in the market, but activists in the market, because our solidarity is with the best artists. They're the ones that we want to succeed. We're building our collections with the most extraordinary works we can find. We're speculators, but we're heritage speculators. We're not financial speculators. We're betting that the works that we choose today are going to be extremely useful in the future to tell the story of today, when that story needs to be told, because we actually have the objects that explain who we are, what we were thinking about, and what we prized as excellence in 2009.
Well, we'll circle back to this issue of the market, and not just of being active on the market, but also interacting with market players later on in the conversation. That's our first big one right there. So, Osvaldo, you are practically from here. You're born in Cuba, your family here. You currently reside, of course, in Mexico City. You're an art historian, a curator, an author, who I think you're the longest-serving director on our panel in your current role in the Museum of Modern Art in Mexico City. Osvaldo has been involved in a wide variety of activities in the art world. He was artistic director of Untitled 5, a public art project on the U.S.-Mexican border. He had run 2 other museums in Mexico City. He's a very widely published writer and, bless your heart, a journalist of sorts, a critic, an arts columnist for La Reforma, leading Mexico City. Since you arrived at your museum, I know you've been working very hard in opening it up to children, to young people, to underprivileged people in Mexico City. It's a very distinguished 65-year-old museum, but with a small staff. Tell me, what is your sort of key challenge as you look out at the future?
Well, I think that we can share a lot of concerns that are common to many museums, but I really think that the museums are very specific to the context they serve. I think in Mexico we're really lucky that we have really a lot of pressure from the context toward the public institutions, because there are a lot of missions that other big museums have that I'm pretty happy not to have. I think that one thing that maybe we can share, but anyway is a main issue in Mexico, is what I would call, let's say, social sustainability.
Social sustainability.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that I feel that we need to rethink the museum in terms of this mission toward the history, building history, building prestige, and to open maybe the curatorial activity to something that will be much more relational, situational within the museum. I feel that...
what do you mean by relational and situational?
I mean that I think that we have really so centered on the aesthetic moment of the exhibition itself, that in a place like Mexico and the history of our modernity, I think I would like to focus on displaying art as something that will be much more interweave with other discourses, with audiences that are not so well located, and on a purpose that is not producing more cultural heroes, but being a little bit more productive in terms of social discourse. And I agree that it's not the only one meaning we want to work on, but I think it's something that in a context like Mexico is not a second range challenge for a curator. And I think we have to get a little bit far from the idea of accumulating and mystification as the main task of the museum. We are not a major institution. We are not in charge to construct big histories. I think we have to rethink the way in which our history has been constructed and the way in which access has been guaranteed for people who have been the actor of that history. And I think that it's not easy in terms of a pragmatic term for a curator to how to shape an exhibition like that, how to create those links as a present experience in the museum. But I think that we have to be clear about what we want, which is the role of it.
So what you're saying is that in order to open up the museum in these necessary ways, you really have to go into the heart of it and rethink the curatorial enterprise underneath it.
Yes, I think that, for example, we have to move the artwork closer to its production moment. I think we have to collaborate from the curatorial with much more with artists, much more with scientific researchers, with educators. I think we have really at least, I think we have the chance. We are not an over-articulated institution, and I think that that's a privilege from the margins. And I think we can really reconceive the curatorial work as a teamwork that is not about being an intermediary for the curatorial discourse, but having much more people as author, as perspective, producing the exhibition.
This is a theme that I think we'll be coming back to several times today. So, Timothy, I just realized I jumped the gun alphabetically, but hopefully nobody noticed, but now they have. So you are the 13th director. This is a very different institution than Osvaldo's. You're the 13th director of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. If you ever want a postcard of a great American, temple on a hill, classic art institution, I think the Philadelphia Museum is pretty much the sort of central casting version of a museum. It is an absolute, don't forget Rocky. For several reasons, he's played a prominent role here at the fair as well, as we know. It's supposed you inherited this September. It was built for a very long time before you. It's an institution that is an icon of its city. You've come here from two recent postings in Cleveland and Cincinnati. and you're a specialist in architectural history and modern and contemporary art. I think alone on this panel, you're also someone who holds an MBA from Yale. And you've got a big institution there that you're starting to think about. So what's foremost on your mind?
Well, thank you. First of all, I'd like to say that I was very pleased to hear you talk about an intellectual diversion from the rest of the fair, but I have to say I wouldn't choose museum directors for intellectual diversion. But we will try our best to nourish you intellectually. When you start a job like mine, with an institution with a $55 million budget, 850,000 square foot physical plant, over 200,000 objects in the collection, and many, many moving parts, you're required to think a lot of things at once. And so many of the topics you'll hear this morning from my colleagues, I too think about, whether it's the internet, virtual museum, and what we're doing to digitize images from our collection, or how we deal with contemporary artists, or the range and breadth of our exhibitions programs. Those are all things that you have to wrap your head around as a director when you begin, and obviously continue to pay attention to. But when I was contacted to serve on this panel, and we chatted a couple of weeks ago, what came to mind, and kind of counterintuitively, because this is a conversation about looking to the future, was in fact a resolutely old-fashioned theme. And that is the role of the Philadelphia Museum of Art as a civic institution. You can probably count on, maybe not one, but certainly two hands, those institutions in the United States that are, those museums that are really truly civic institutions. And I think Philadelphia is one of them. It was founded and built with city funding. It occupies, as András said, a remarkable place, physically speaking, geographically speaking, within the landscape of Philadelphia, at the end of Benjamin Franklin Parkway, and a great large Greek temple. A critic early on called it a great Greek garage because it was so large and it was so empty at the time. But it has a place within the landscape, physically, intellectually, historically, of Philadelphia that's very important for a director to understand and to take advantage of. It is part of the city's psyche. It receives a great deal of funding and support from the city in lots of different ways, both publicly and privately. So how we look to the future and how we position, continue to position and refine the role of the museum within Philadelphia and the region is a very, very important issue for me. And it has many different dimensions. Part of it, of course, is purely administrative. What conversations do we have with the city about future funding? How can we continue to get from city, state, and federal governments funding for the work we want to do, because we are such an important piece of Philadelphia? How do we participate in the conversation about Philadelphia's future economically and educationally, because again, we are such a critical piece of those conversations.
Timothy, just let me ask you, how much of your funding is actually from the city?
We receive about $2.3 million from the city.
In percentage terms, that's how big?
That's a very, very small percentage. It's about 5% of our budget. On the other hand, the city does own our building and take care of it when persuaded to do so. And that requires some persuasion. But we have, a huge building that requires constant maintenance and upgrading and the like. And again, although I want to say that the financial piece of things is very important in terms of this idea of the civic institution, what's far more important for me is how the museum represents, and it does so quite richly, Philadelphia's place within the history of American art, how it tells that story, and how it participates in a conversation about Philadelphia in the future in terms of the arts. We have in that regard a truly instrumental role to play.
And I suspect that this is true. As you say, in some ways, the Philadelphia Museum is in a very high category, or a very unusual category, but to some extent it's true of every museum as well, that sense of being at the heart of the city and what that means and how it can maintain that position at the heart of the civic culture. I think every one of your institutions thinks about it in itself in these terms. So it's on to you, Philippe. You are the interloper on this panel. It's not too late to leave. Philippe is the only person on this panel who's not strictly speaking running a museum in the same sense as, let's say, Timothy's museum is. But of course, he's running a distinguished visual arts organization that is every bit as important to New York City as its other distinguished museums. Philippe is taken over the DIA at a moment of transition for the organization, and also in a moment when it's revisiting its roots. Thank you very much. In Chelsea, where it's looking at building a new building, and we'll talk a bit more about buildings in a minute. He was previously Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the Walker in Minneapolis. He co-curated the Whitney Biennial, had director positions at the Marseille Contemporary Art Museum, and of course the François Pinault Foundation Museum when it was in Paris, on the board of the Andy Warhol Museum. So he knows a thing or two about museums. So tell us what's on your mind.
I had a moment of first me a little bit. First, I think Dia took me over, rather than me taking Dia over. As I told you before the panel, and I might be in the wrong panel, but I wrote a story to address your question. I wrote an African mythology, because I know that you all came here this morning to hear about African mythology. And it's largely inspired by a fantastic book by the Nigerian writer Ben Okri, called The Star Book. And here is my story. There are two tribes. One tribe is a fantastic tribe which is exclusively composed of artists, men and women. They all do art. They all like great master of their skills. Every time they produce a work, the work is received with huge acknowledgement. They master all the tradition of what art making entailed. But as much as their art amazed the eyes, their art never amazed the vision. And their art, as much as the art was immediately received with astonishment, the art was always talked of and never talked about. And the great frustration of this tribe is that they believe at some point that they were not producing art, they were producing artifacts. That was my first tribe. Then there is a second tribe. And this is a tribe which is exclusively composed of artists, men and women. The only thing they do in their life every day, they produce art. The only difference with the other tribe is that they don't even know they're producing art. Most of the time, the art they produce is invisible and remains invisible for years and years and years until someone decides, well, this art or this object or this phenomenon makes sense with the state of our society. And they start to talk about that, and the minute they start to talk about it, the art appears. So by creating a language for the art is revealed. The only problem also with this tribe is that they took enormous pleasure in not understanding anything about what they're doing. And that the highest level of art for them is the highest level of misunderstanding of the objects they produce. Because they always felt that if you understand an object, well, you don't look at it anymore. Understanding of the art, understanding of whatever they do, was going in the way of looking, seeing, and thinking. There is another part of my story, that the first tribe was very extremely visible, overexposed, and the other tribe, as much as everybody knew about it, nobody knew where they were. Nobody knew where to locate this tribe. So it was an endless search to figure out, where are they, what are they doing, and is that art? And that's my way to answer your question, because I think that in many ways, in this golden age of museum, where I think there is about 17,500 accredited museums in this country, I think between $4 and $5 billion have been spent in creating new museums over the last 10 years in America. I actually think we're still looking for the tribe. Thank you.
Well, I think we can all go home now. I think we should observe a moment of silence for the great French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss.
I'm not talking about mad masters.
Lynn, we saved the best to last.
Yes.
Although we're just getting started. So she's one of the directors who's still unpacking, although her office apparently, thanks to your wonderful assistant, is fully unpacked. Your home, however, is not. She's at the Carnegie Museum of Art, again, one of those great, classic, encyclopedic icons of a major American city, where she just took over after 14 years at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, where you headed up the Department of Contemporary Art. And previously to that, another small museum you might have heard of, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And of course, you started out your life as a university professor and continued to write. Again, you've inherited a very prestigious institution, one that you're trying to put on a new path. What exactly are you thinking about foremost as you look out at the future?
Well, first of all, before I answer that question, I am compelled to note that I am the only person on this panel who you didn't have to identify by what they're wearing. And there's a reason for that. There is still not enough women in our field. That problem has not been solved.
You're working on it. Look out at the audience.
Yeah, the audience. Well, the audience for the arts and the art world has always been filled with women. It's the top slots that we're talking about. So, when I first considered going to the Carnegie Museum of Art, I took a look at the website and was really astounded by what I saw. Because this museum sits between Carnegie Mellon University, which is enormously famous worldwide for its computers, the mix of computers and art, the mix of computers and technology, robotics, green technology, the whole thing. And Pitt, University of Pittsburgh on the other side, that has also a very important investment in technology and research within technology. And the museum has a lousy website. I mean, beyond lousy, primitive, really bad. And I thought,
it's not alone. It's not alone.
And I thought, this is really terrible. The web is, I told them, our other front door. I also told them that in this country today, the opiate of the masses, opinion is the opiate of the masses. People think that when they have voiced their opinion, they have actually done something. They even think they've done politics. So I believe that cultural institutions can be a bulwark against that kind of facile thinking. But I don't think we can do it unless we speak the languages of the 21st century. So we have been involved in the 4 months that I've been in the museum. This is very new for me. We've been involved in brainstorming what the website could be, what it should be, how we want to think about it. And one of the things that became very clear early on was that it couldn't just be an add-on. Every time you did something, you couldn't just do something, oh, for this exhibition we'll do this, for that exhibition we'll do that. It really had to be almost a virtual museum, a second museum that exists in parallel to the physical museum that you already have. And it needed, from my point of view, I really wanted it to be a way of publicizing the research that the curators do. I wanted it to be a publishing mode. I wanted it to be a marketing mode. I wanted it to be a way of selling stuff out of the store. I wanted it to be a place for artist projects. I wanted it to be this whole, basically, other museum. And this is not just me, this is everyone on the staff working together to get to that decision. What that means for us is that basically you have to build an infrastructure to go with it, because a website has to interact with your ticketing platform. It has to interact with your data gathering and data retrieval capabilities. It's your whole IT system. And so it becomes a very expensive proposition for a museum that doesn't have a huge infrastructure already in place to do that kind of work. I was told by one of my colleagues that because the Carnegie Museum of Art is one of 4 museums, there's the Carnegie Museum of Art, the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, the Warhol Museum, and the Science Center. And none of them have very good websites. And I was told by one of my colleagues that the Museum of Natural History in New York employs over 100 people to work on both its website and its IT systems. And this morning I got up, and when I got up, I went onto the website and I looked at the Museum of Natural History website, and it didn't work. It was really great. The marketing, the shop worked, the ticketing worked, but to try to get into the shows and see what the shows were really about, and to get into the intellectual content. So maybe you can overdo it. That's the other possibility. But in any case, for us, that's going to be a major thrust, and it's one of a number of things that I really want to do. I don't want to give up the physical museum for the virtual museum, but I want the virtual museum to really be in a position to develop and move forward and be dynamic and be able to adjust to change.
It's true, isn't it, that many museums really still treat their websites as a kind of glorified information brochure. It's mainly, the assumption is people use it to figure out the best parking and opening hours. And maybe because it's so rooted in physical objects, most museums really haven't made that plunge. Not that it will ever offset what they do, but it's a major shift that's clearly for you all to oversee. So,
well, the relationship between the physical object and the virtual object is a really interesting one, and it was really brought home to me recently at various art fairs where I heard collectors say, JPEG me that, or it was a work that wasn't there. In other words, they could buy it on the internet from a JPEG, which for me is still impossible to imagine. So.
Well, I think we have thank you very much. These are first salvos, and hopefully we'll not get rained on. I don't know if the gods are trying to send us a signal with respect to the future of museums. But we put a number of issues out on the table. Talked about the relationship to the market. We talked about the relationship to the community, the role of museums as civic institutions. We talked about the tribes. We talked really about the fact that to the extent that museums as institutions can sort of stifle the art as much as promote it. And we talked about the sort of challenge of going online, everything that entails. That is a lot of work to be done, and we're still only scraping the surface, because let's not forget, you're also keeping doors open, maintaining staffs, keeping those objects protected and insured. So what I'd like to do now is just sort of, as they say on CNN, dig deeper on a couple of issues. And I hope I'll be forgiven here at this Art Basel weekend for starting out on the issue of money. Maybe it's appropriate. At risk of being overly practical, my question is, who's going to pay for all of this? How are you thinking about rethinking your fundraising, but especially how are you thinking about, given the fact that foundation sources, public sources, earned income sources are all flatlining at best, how are you going to support the Center Club?
First of all, you drew such a bleak picture at the beginning. As Philippe said, we might as well shoot ourselves. I think that they're not flatlining. And I think that, at least in Pittsburgh, the foundations are trying very hard to make up for any, when they can't, they're very sensitive to what they're not giving to the institutions. So I think, and they're really trying to make up for that. So we're all working together. I don't think that's the only situation. I think you need to look at all of the different financial structures because every
Yes.
museum here has a different
We have a great variety of circulating. Marc, for example, you have the vast majority of your support is public.
Yes, about 85% of it. We're shooting for 20% earned income, and I am very focused on that, but it's not as easy as it sounds. For example, we live on a fixed income, András, so the numbers change every few years when your machine can make a very long and complex argument for increased funding. My problem right now is that Americans don't have passports. That's my biggest problem. That caused me some serious issues this summer. So please get passports and come to Mexico and come to Canada especially. Normally we get about 14% of our visitors in the summer are Americans. This year it was 1%. So it wasn't because we didn't have the Pope's Renaissance drawings or the Queen's Renaissance drawings. We did. We just didn't have a lot of tourists. So that's a problem. And also, of course, the cost of doing business is going up. It's going up for all of us. When you've got this fixed government funding, those are the sorts of things that lead you to then resort to layoffs, because when you've already gone dark for part of your year, you can't do anything else. It's not that bleak, though. I agree with Lynn. Our endowment, for example, has recouped all of its losses. So we're cheering up, and we're making deals with all kinds of other institutions so that we can all have a better life and continue as if nothing happened.
So is it true for all of you that the situation is not as bleak as it was, let's say 6-7 months ago, and that you feel optimistic that you can do what you need to do based on projected revenues or fundraising?
Well, I don't know about that. I can tell you what, for me, what it triggered, the fact that we were in a different financial world, and what I was telling Lynn this morning, I started at the day Lehman Brothers collapsed, and the day Damien Hirst did his masterful auction. With the lack of resources, or the different way to access resources, what it forced us to do, and actually it was an interesting exercise, is to reconsider the way we go through the day, and reconsider the way we actually we do our jobs. Why do we do it, and for whom do we do it, and how do we do it? And you know, there is, for me, there was a silver lining in this moment, because it gave us the time to actually slow down a little bit.
Right, it gave you a sense of focus.
A sense of focus, and eventually to use this transition moment to reconsider a little bit the way we operate. So it was not.
Can you be specific about that?
Well, yeah, I can, since you're asking. You know, when I started with DIA, I was under the mandate by DIA's board to identify the new space for DIA in the city, and you know, I was very excited about that. I started to run all over the city to look at building and dream big, and every time I was seeing a building, I was like, oh my God, this is beautiful, I love it. And the day after, I was like, oh my God, this is beautiful, I love that one better. I became a serial monogamist, like Tiger Woods. And then I realized that, well, what do I really need? You know, do I need this big buildings? Do I need, how much space do I need? Not do I need, how much space do an artist need to produce what I think the artists need to produce with us? And that was a really, you know, it's not brain surgery, but it was a way to actually reconsider our addiction to let's go big, and let's go big right now.
Well, I'm so glad you raised that, because I certainly wanted us to talk about buildings, unless somebody was getting ready to make a comment about money.
Well, I think the moment you started to talk about money, it began to rain. I think
that was so hard to arrange. Art Basel had to work really hard on that.
Many of us have behaved the way you and the audience are. We put up umbrellas, we wrapped our ourselves in the shawl. We've protected ourselves for a year or so, but I think that's more a matter of trimming sails than really changing things entirely. I think the real issue for the long term, and I'll be brief about this, is what this economy has meant for the assumptions we've had about growth. And we're coming off of a very long period of remarkable growth in the museum world, and the question is whether that rate of change will continue or diminish significantly. Not that we won't continue to do the work, the museum will do it in very interesting ways. It's just a matter of how much we can do.
So again, can you be specific with respect to your own institution, what that would mean for you, that kind of rethink?
At the margins, it means being very clear about why we do exhibitions that are going to cost a lot of money, and how much we can expect in terms of sponsorship and revenue at the gate. That's just a fact, and that's a very difficult fact. It means being very clear about what things we do that are not going to have a financial return, that are central to the mission of the museum, putting resources towards those. I think at the end of the day, it's going to, coming back to a point that's been discussed before, and I think it's where you're heading, it's going to require museums to think very carefully and critically about capital investment in the future, because raising the kinds of money that has been raised for renovations and expansions is going to be extremely difficult to do.
Yes, so in the end, we're getting right back to Philippe's issue. Go ahead.
Also, I have, we all talk about the financial crisis and the way it affects us, and it is affecting us. But I think there is another way for me to think about that. Actually, I would even question the fact that whether or not we are in a financial crisis. I think we name it financial crisis because everything we've been doing, not only in the art community, has been measured by financial success, financial result. I don't know how much sense I would make with that, but I think it's the way I'm trying to reconsider what I'm doing as a professional in this field is, but I think the financial crisis is the first layer or manifestation of another kind of crisis that we are facing. And I think we are facing a cultural and values crisis, that we don't know how to represent ourselves in the world besides the financial measurement of what we do. And when you talk from a cultural institution, institution point of view, that's what we do. We are in the knowledge industry, if any industry. And what we do is to contribute to represent who we are here and now as a society.
And it's fair to say that museums, in a way, became emblems of this society expressing itself through material wealth. The wealthier we got, the flashier our buildings became, the flashier our facilities became. So all of these issues hang together. The question now is, we've had this frightening year. Now things have stabilized. Do you actually see that there has been, a long-term sort of behavior modification? Or was it just sort of a close call and now everybody's moving forward on the old assumptions?
I think that I want to sort of just step back for one moment to some of the things that have been said. And at the Carnegie, what we have is we have a situation where until 1970, the endowments for the museum was such that it had to do no fundraising until 1970. And so that's remarkable, and it's most of these endowments come from the old Pittsburgh family, the Heinzes, the Mellons, the Scapes, those people. It obviously over the years has depleted, and it's not going to last forever. It's not going to go on forever. So we are in a position where we have to rejigger ourselves. We have to rethink who we are and how we operate.
So what will that mean for you?
Well, I don't know, because it's not something that you can do overnight. Right. It's something that we're sitting in committees amongst all 4 museums, sometimes within one museum, trying to understand how it's possible to do that. But in a way, the financial crisis was a good thing for us because it made us come to terms.
Examine your fundamental assumptions.
Right, exactly. It made us to come to terms with that. And I very much agree with everything that Philippe was saying about the values that we espouse and the way that those values are communicated to the public. And I'm very happy not to be able to build buildings.
Well, let's continue on that theme of values. Rather, the substance of the program. because quite apart from money, there is a great imperative to open the museum to a wider public. I've already mentioned that the audience attendance trends are, not as good as we thought they were supposed to be. We always thought museums were the sort of fine arts institutions that were bucking the trend of, let's say, classical music organization, opera. But that isn't quite the case. A majority of Americans don't visit museums regularly. There's a lot of discussion, and museums have done a lot about it, opening their doors, becoming more democratic. So my question to you is, how, assuming that you want to be that and be more open, how do you popularize the museum without vulgarizing the museum?
This is a key issue. For example, in my head, I think my job is, my generation's job is to finally finish the business of agorifying the Pantheon. But we can't really stoop to the low standards of the Agora, because then we wouldn't be a Pantheon. And that's a problem. We've been set up to do that now with our catering kitchens and our music on Sundays, etc. But the thing that I find most depressing is I don't want to go back to the depressing subject. We are being punished by baby Jesus, I think, because we're not about money. We never were about money, we're about culture. And we've been lured into, again now, the second wave, because we were about money for a while as we were building and growing because there was so much. Now that there isn't, we're still about money. That's almost all we talk about in my senior staff meetings. We talk very little about what we're doing there, and that is to deliver culture. And that's becoming a little depressing, I have to say. So you've got to fight this and resist it and find a way not to have to be dealing with money all the time. And I completely agree with you.
And how do you strike this balance? I see lots of microphones at the ready.
There is I was just going to say the Warhol Museum has a relatively low visitorship. It's largely people who come in from out of town, who, if you don't count the parties that they throw on Friday nights, a relatively low visitorship, but their website has an enormous visitorship. I mean, huge. So how do you count the audience for the Warhol Museum under those conditions?
I think I'm a very, very privileged member of this panel who can actually claim that I have the lowest number of visitors among all of you. I'll give you an example. We have a fabulous installation that's been up for 42 years. It's 3 hours for the first town. It's in the middle of the desert. We have one, talking about invisible art, we have one piece in Kassel, Germany, which is the pole, 1 kilometer long, buried vertically into the ground. The only thing you see is the top of it. So how do I advertise that? Yeah, it's hardly a blockbuster. But I also think that we played with fire. We thought that we could compete, or we had the desire to compete in, or we were put in the situation to compete in the entertainment industry. And I think we talked about that. We confused what was popular and what was populist. Popular is bottom up, populist is top down. And populist for me is, and there is conversation about, let's open the door of museum, let's be more populist. And I think first, it's triggered by this financial conversation, I think.
So it's popular for the wrong reasons.
Well, it's populism because you need to get the turnpike coming. I also think that the populism in this case is extremely disrespectful of the audience, because it's a way not to call a cow, because it's actually a form of elitism. If we think that elitism is a small group of people deciding for the larger group what's good for them. And when you talk about blockbuster, actually, I think that's what you're talking about. So, again, I'm still looking after my tribe, because I know why we have to do that. But how do we negotiate this conundrum in our programs?
Osvaldo, this is specifically what you were talking about. I mean, you, as the longest serving in your current role, you've really been trying to do this. Have you been able to find the balance?
Something that might be related to that is, for example, when you get a museum like the Museum of Modern Art in Mexico,
you have the issue about hegemony, how hegemony has been constructed through art history in Mexico, and how that discourse has been used to be consumed by the masses, the big author, the big history, and that's something that somehow is related because, for example, I have two works ahead in terms of deconstructing that big history and the big Mexican identity and the identity related to the relation with the state ideology, and even how the institution, because we're a public institution, push you to, for example, to consume blockbuster exhibitions that are coming from your museum. You have to pay the very expensive liability platform with which you operate just to show up as good museums, and how it's really hard to produce exhibitions that might be artistically strong, but related somehow in terms of meaning with the population that, in the case of a museum, are teenagers, low-class public schools, whose another alternative is the mall. To walk around the mall, and even not to buy, just to, no, they cannot buy. Hang out, and no. No, but it's very interesting because the kind of populism is another one, and actually the kind of hegemony that you are pushed to produce is another one. And this is sort of like a challenge that is, I think, is political, and this is how we conceive museum as political institutions that we are.
Philippe, do you feel a pressure? I mean, you were talking about museum as a civic institution. I mean, can you go, for example, and press for more support from your city without sort of demonstrating that your numbers are, that you're opening the institution more? Is that something that's an externally imposed imperative as well?
Well, let's take a poll in the audience. Those of you who think I can get more money if I have fewer visitors from the city or the state, raise your hands. It's that's a clear and pressing issue. I'm just going to add a few polemic notes to the conversation thus far and say that I think that this question of Pantheon and Agora, or high and low, is a bit of a false dichotomy, particularly in terms of civic institutions. My job is to open the door and encourage people to walk in for whatever reason they choose. And I think that is a truly democratic impulse and the right one for a civic institution. The terms of engagement with the work of art in the galleries, what people do in the museum is another issue entirely, a very rich and productive one. But if the choice is not made to walk in the door and people don't understand the museum as a civic resource and one that is available and open with a very fluid boundary, then that concerns me a great deal. The other thing that concerns me now with respect to this generation and the future is that the media that at least my museum represents across the board, we collect and we have everything, painting, sculpture, decorative arts, prints, drawings, and so on. A classically composed collection is increasingly foreign to an audience that's growing up on facsimiles and on the internet and consuming a range of a very rich mix of visual materials that no longer are represented in museum collections, and how we bridge that gap and engage them with things that aren't on the walls of their own houses or their parents' houses or apartments is a very complicated and very interesting issue, and one I think we need to pay a lot of attention to.
I just want to have a quick check. How many people might have a question for our group? So we have a small number of questions. Sure. Well, as usual, there's not enough time to cover every issue. I sort of want to blend two questions together and get your last thoughts, and then we'll see what else comes up. I think I had hoped to spend more time on this very last issue that you did raise, which is how do you take an institution devoted to physical objects and fairly clear categories of knowledge and lead it into a world that is very virtual and has a very liquid approach to knowledge and information. But as a way of just a quick conclusion, I want to sort of ask sort of two questions and one from each of you. Number one, when all is said and done, all the topics we looked about, which one do you think is the single greatest challenge? But if you wouldn't mind also perhaps looking out beyond the world of museums and suggest if there's anything outside of our world that perhaps answers some of the challenges. When we look at other industries, other cultural sectors, is there something that you think that they're doing that if the museum world was doing it, you could meet your challenges better?
I think we're unique. We're not going to certainly find models in the commercial world for how to get people in the door. I'm not going to be showing Michael J. Fox's watercolors, for example. We really are a Pantheon. We're about excellence. That's the point since the French Revolution. So getting people in the door, I actually think the Pope has the right idea. It's not how many Catholics there are going to be in the world, it's are they really Catholics? It's important that we serve people the way they need to be served, and that is as a benchmark for what constitutes excellence in their culture. We do have to get them in the door, but we can't do that by compromising our mission. I think we're also competing with ourselves. Our websites are competing with our institutions. You know, seeing art, you have, as you know, the reason you're here, you had to travel here. You didn't come to Miami on your website. That wouldn't be the point. You can JPEG each other, but if you're actually an art lover and not a speculator, you're not interested in the JPEG. You want to see the thing.
For me, I'll pick up on the last point I made, and that is that we talked about attendance, but I'd rather not talk about attendance, but rather participation. And that is to say, to explore the reasons that people come to museums, and to think about how we can give them more reasons to come and deepen that relationship. And if we talk about participation, we invariably brings you to consideration what you're doing with your collection, how to present it, how it becomes successful to a broad audience, and that I think is a key to the work, as I bring it full circle, the work of a civic institution like ours.
Lynn?
Yeah, I want to agree with that, and I think that whatever problems we're having, they are microcosms of a larger problem that has to do with the, let's say, changing definition of civitas in our society at large, and that's where we have to be, you know, we have to do the job we have to do, which is the art we care about, the art we love. We have to take care of it, we have to write about it, but we also, as directors, have to be very aware of the fact that we run up what is essentially, you know, we have a political responsibility. And I think that we have to really pay attention to that, and that our ability to educate people, our ability to give them a space that might be contemplative is a political gesture. And I think that that's terribly important, and that's where my focus will be.
Yes, I'm going to be back to the idea that Philippe said about the crisis. I agree that I think we are living a crisis of paradigm somehow. And I feel that the museums cannot keep working on their missions, like thinking that there's not that right, that they're not part of it. So I think that we really need to reshape our missions in terms of referring knowledge we are producing, what kind and quality of access to that knowledge we are producing. And that should be everything from the museum. I don't think that is something to the market or to other sphere. I think that's something that's about keeping museums alive as institutions and facing the crisis of paradigm that we give us. And we are part of that crisis. We represent it and we function under that kind of dysfunctional.
I think it's Jerry Soules who wrote that a few years ago, talking about the market and how the market. And he said, well, it's not because the air is polluted that we are going to stop breathing. But we can learn to breathe better. And I think, you ask, is there models we can follow from outside or field? I don't know about that. I think for me, and I'm not even sure that museums are here to educate people, but I think the key question for me is a question of education, again, from bottom up. What is the access to education in general? Or are we educated to engage with objects, projects, and ideas that are not familiar to us, or people who are not familiar to us. And I think for me, this very key idea of it starts, with education is something that we, as someone who is involved with the knowledge industry, I think we address every day when we decide that burying vertically a pole 1 kilometer in the ground because we think it's the greatest work of art in the world is something we need to think about. Or what kind of language develop to make this idea accessible and to allow people not only to tell them not what to think about it, but just to think about it, whether they like it or not. And it's great if they don't like it.
Well, thank you for all your thoughts. I've been hoping that the rain would stop, but really we haven't said anything to appease the rain gods.